Welcome back to our series on engaging the university. This is the third in a four-part series. Let's begin today by looking first at what we covered in session one. We proposed that there are three premises that should govern our way of thinking about being Christians engaging the university. The first is that God is everywhere in the university, in the library, in the classrooms, in the laboratories, in the dormitories, on the playing fields. The second is that God has given us, graduate students and faculty, a rather rare calling given to very few people to serve a very distinctive institution in the society. And the third premise is that we are called to bring a particular kind of meaning to this rather critical institution, and that is Christian meaning. In that first session, we discussed one academic's spiritual autobiography, and particularly a journey from a kind of a spiritual schizophrenia, where the faith life and the academic life operated on separate tracks and had very little to do with each other, to the integration of faith and learning. This was a story of struggles and breakthroughs. In our second session, we opened with the example of Jesus on the road to Emmaus. Two men had been in Jerusalem observing the events of the previous week, and they'd seen this extraordinary sight of the man they thought was the Messiah, being taken to the cross, crucified, put to death, and all their hopes were dashed. And as they were walking back to Emmaus, they were trying to make sense of what they had seen. And then Jesus came alongside them and gave them new meaning. It's this kind of new meaning to our calling that Jesus brings to us, and indeed it is the calling that we have to the university to bring meaning to this great institution. And one way we propose this can be done is through conversation. And so in our last session, we talked about what is a conversation. We discussed what a conversation is not. We discussed why are we conversing and looked at the various kinds of conversations in the universities. We talked about who are our conversation partners, and we concluded by saying that conversations in the university are a way that we as Christians can develop virtues and thus move towards spiritual maturity. Now, today, we review ways to put our conversational approach into practice. We imagine programming that is going to reach to all parts of the university through the eyes of faith. We imagine ways of doing that through conversations. Let me offer you a framework for dialogical engagement. One way of thinking systematically about our role in the university is to ask, where do our conversations occur? And I suggest that they occur sometimes inside Christian circles, and sometimes they occur in the whole university. We can also ask, how do our conversations occur? Very often, most often, they occur informally, but they can also occur formally in actual programs that we organize. So if we put these two dimensions together, we get a series of activities, of practical activities that can go on within our Christian circles. Some of them are informal, some of them are formal. We can also see a series of activities that can go on within the entire university. Again, many of those are informal, but some of them are also formal. And so today what we're going to do is to discuss examples of each of these with particular attention to the formal sessions inside Christian circles, passion talks, and many variations on passion talks, as well as some other possibilities. And we're going to talk about some of the programs that have been observed, tried in various universities in other parts of the world, or in different parts of the world. Let's begin by thinking about informal conversations that go on within our Christian community. And here, what is absolutely crucial in my view is that we learn ourselves how to refine the practice of questioning. As I said in our last session, questioning often doesn't come easily to academics because often we like to speak out. We like to give lectures, as it were. We like to be didactic. But being able to question is absolutely crucial, not only in our learning of academic skills, but also our learning of conversations that are relevant to the mission of the university. And so I think and emphasize for myself and actually practice in my own research this art of questioning. We should begin easily by finding a conversational partner, another graduate student, and saying to that student, what did you do your undergraduate work on? What was your specialty field? Or if you did an honors thesis, what was that thesis on? Or if you're now a doctoral student, what did you do your master's thesis on? Some just very simple background questions. And then that can move to what it is that you're currently focused on. What interests you at this particular moment? Do you know what your research topic is that you're hoping to explore as you go forward? What is that? What kinds of methods will you be using? What kinds of data and materials are you going to be collecting? Are you going to be working with? In this process, I find it very useful to try and find some sort of connection with a person. For example, I try to show why I might be interested in a given topic if there's any kind of connection that I can find whatsoever. Sometimes those connections are strange. When I was working on criminal justice in China, very frequently the issue of corruption would come up, corruption in the courts. And I would say, well, in Chicago, we have this problem in the traffic courts that for decades we've never managed to entirely solve the problem of corruption. And that was always a great stimulus to the conversation because no Chinese person, or most Chinese people, weren't used to Americans coming and saying what was wrong with our society. So it was a way of stimulating the conversation. Other ways of finding a connection are saying, well, you studied this, but I studied something similar or something adjacent to what you studied. Or you can laugh at yourself and say, well, the closest I've ever come to that particular topic is watching a movie or of reading a novel. Or maybe it's something that I read in the science section of the newspaper. I love to read the science section of the New York Times or the Guardian. And that's piqued my interest. Or I had a friend in college who was studying something like what you're discussing, some way of establishing some sort of affinity with the person. Always there will be questions if somebody's working on a field, especially far removed from us, that ask for simplifications. So this is an attempt to try and find a common language, a lingua franca, that enables us to sort of move down from the specialty levels that each of us have to find a language that each of us can understand. And actually, that's a very good thing for both people in a conversation. It's very good for the person asking the questions because it means that they have to be careful in the way in which they pose their questions. It's very good for the person who is answering the questions because they have to think of ways of taking their field and translating it for a wider audience, which actually is a very useful skill for teaching and for academic life more broadly. Often inviting analogies or metaphors to help understanding makes a big difference. When physicists are talking about something complicated and they can say, well, light moves in waves, that's something that the rest of us can sort of begin to understand because we kind of know what a wave looks like, and so we can get some kind of window into the obscure and arcane worlds in which they often move and have their being. And of course, asking clarifying questions is absolutely crucial to the practice of questioning, and we could talk about this for an entire session. Questions about definition, questions that ask for amplifying what the person said, enormously valuable. But alongside the practice of questioning is the practice of listening, of asking people what is the problem that they're trying to grapple with, what's the issue that they're trying to solve. And one good way of both questioning and listening is to be saying to the person, to be sure that I understand what you have just said, was it the following? And then you try and translate into your words what you think that you have heard. Or an expression I often use is, are you saying that X, Y, or Z? This shows that you're engaged in active listening. I think also we're listening not only for words, but we're listening for emotion. What is it that really excites a person? I gave a retreat or a workshop at a retreat in Northern California for doctoral students at the University of California at Berkeley and Stanford and the University of California at Santa Cruz. And as part of that retreat, I was asked to organize a session in which I questioned two doctoral students in fields radically different from my own, people that I didn't know. One person was working on obscure physics of solar panels, and another person was doing Greek poetry from the 4th century BC. Both topics I know nothing about whatsoever. And so I sat down first with one person and began to question her, and then another person, and then began to question him. And in both cases, if you were listening to my series of questions and their answers, there was a point where suddenly their excitement level, their emotional level kicked in, and you could immediately hear that they were hooked. And that's a really rather crucial thing to be listening for in conversations. I also like to ask and then listen for what are the big divides or the big debates in a field. This might not be appropriate in every field, but in many, many of the fields that I have worked in myself or that I've discussed with other people, often there are huge divisions. One group of people think this, another group of people think that. There have been these long struggles, and by asking somebody to tell you what those are is a very, very helpful way both to enable your understanding, but often to actually engage the listener as well. I would also say that in this process of questioning and listening, we need to be purposeful. Invite somebody to have lunch with us or tea with us, another graduate student, where we actually get together and we take some time where we are together one-on-one and we can really focus on what each other is thinking and doing. Let's turn now to think about some more organized activities within the Christian community that can be great stimuli to conversations. One is what I call low-key introductions that can go on inside your Christian graduate group, for instance, at a university. I remember a while back I was invited to speak with a graduate Christian group on a major university campus. It was a relatively small group, I suppose a dozen people, and we were all sitting around the table. And the first thing that I did was ask each of the graduate students, they mostly were doctoral students, I asked each of them just to take 2 or 3 minutes to tell me what was their field, and if they already were fairly well advanced, what were they actually working on. And so each of them went around the table and very briefly talked about the topic of their interest and their research. After the session, one of those graduate students came up to me and she said something rather sad. She said, that is the first time in all the years that I've been in a Christian graduate group that anybody has ever asked me about the field, my interests, my topics of work, the areas in which I spend 50 or 60 or 70 hours a week studying. This is sad because it demonstrates that there is a real disconnect between their studies and what the Christian group is doing, that essentially in this respect, the Christian group was irrelevant to their studies. And so I propose to many Christian groups that at the beginning of each year or each term, one way of introducing ourselves to each other is to simply go around and ask each of us to describe what we're working on. And that also sets up the beginnings of conversations and can be a launching pad for further conversations later on. Another formal practice inside universities that's become very popular in North America and to some degree on other continents, especially in Australia, what we call passion talks. These passion talks emerged originally at Stanford University. The idea is very simple, that a graduate student is given 10 or 15 or 20 minutes to prepare a presentation, usually a slide presentation, where she or he describes for the rest of the Christian group their topic of scholarship, their work in the laboratory or in the community or in the hospital. And they are asked to give this talk in a way that is understandable to people from any other discipline in the university. So if you are a geologist, you have to be able to speak in the way that an architecture student could understand. And if you're somebody in the performing arts and music, you have to be able to speak in a way that a lawyer or a scientist can understand. So these students talk about their own work, and then toward the latter part of the presentation, they begin to talk a little bit about what they see to be the intersections between their work and their faith. And this may be a shorter part of the presentation where they raise a few issues, and then they ask the group to engage with them to think Christianly. They ask the group to help them see what kinds of connections there might be between biblical themes or theological themes that could help them think about their topics. And here are some of the topics that Stanford University students were talking about. Some were working in artificial intelligence and computer science, others in psychology, neuroscience, somebody in musicology, somebody in the law school in property rights. And these have turned out to be extraordinarily effective, popular, and have made a real difference, as you can see from that quotation by a student. A fantastic demonstration of how integration of our faith and our research might look like. And I say also that one of the advantages of preparing these passion talks is that as an academic skill, it's a good way to learn how to present one's work in general, but also to a wider audience. Now, there are variations on passion talks in different parts of the world. If you go to the Engage University Resources website, you'll see a presentation, and you will see a set of notes on 7 variations on the theme. One variation is called lightning talks, which are sort of a bit similar to the introductory talks I mentioned a couple of slides ago. These are where there are very quick ways that people get together and everybody very quickly says, this is what I'm working on. These are the questions I'm thinking about. Here's a connection I see with my Christian faith. What do you think? One program that has been tried very effectively in Australia by the Simeon Network, which is a network of Christian graduate students and faculty, is called Thinking Truth Together. And in a number of major Australian cities like Melbourne or Sydney or Brisbane or Canberra, these Christian academics have a one-day event. And one form of Thinking Truth Together is where each person at the event just speaks very briefly, like a mini passion talk, about their discipline and the kind of connections that they see with their faith. And then they brainstorm with the other people who have come in, sometimes from their university, sometimes from other universities in the same city. And it's something that's very quick and very sharp. There are variations on this theme as well. At some universities, for example, the University of Queensland in Brisbane, a much more demanding and sophisticated version of this is where a group of advanced doctoral students, postdoctoral fellows, and faculty got together, and they actually presented 20 or 30-page papers to each other as if it were an academic conference. People from a number of different disciplines. And again, one of the great values of this is that it compelled me, a sociologist, to be able to write in a way that somebody in the medical school could understand, or it required that somebody in the biological sciences write in a way that somebody in public health or in music or in the humanities could understand. And that in itself is very important, a skill to learn. Another way that this can happen is in faculty presentations on their current interests. So faculty can be invited to a Christian group, Christian faculty, not necessarily to give what looks like a passion talk, but just simply to ask the faculty to think about what interests and excites you right now. What kinds of puzzles are on your mind? What's something that you're right in the middle of? And almost all faculty at research universities are struggling with something. They're thinking about something. And it's very, very useful for faculty to be able to come to graduate students, to demonstrate to graduate students that faculty themselves are struggling, wrestling with something that they can't solve, or something that is a problem that needs working through. So this is a good way to tap into a faculty member's energy, and it's a good way for the faculty member to stimulate a response from graduate students. And as those of us who have been faculty for a long time know, often the most naive responses or questions can open our eyes in a way that we didn't expect. Here's another suggestion that I've not seen anywhere, but I think is potentially very promising. And that is, what if in universities where there are graduate Christian groups and there are also undergraduate Christian groups, if the graduate students had the opportunity to go and speak to the undergraduates and give kind of mini passion talks to the undergraduates. In fine universities where the undergraduates are very strong, this is a great way in which the graduate students can learn to refine their skills. It's a way of inspiring undergraduates about the possibility of academic life as graduate students or in the academic life. And it's potentially a way in which undergraduates can be mentored by graduate students. Another more formal approach within a Christian community is something with which I've been closely associated at the Australian National University. We call it scholarly circles. And this is a situation where inside a university there are a number of faculty and graduate students in a field closely enough to each other that we can have pretty high-level conversations with each other. So at my appointment at the Australian National University a number of years ago, I was introduced to a Christian political scientist who then introduced me to other Christian professors and students doing international relations. And after a few informal discussions over tea and coffee and drinks, we decided that we should go a step further because we were excited by each other's work. And so the first thing we did after informally learning about each other was to write a long abstract about a particular subject that we were working on now and how we are beginning to think about it or are thinking about it as Christians. Just a page or a page and a half, something pretty straightforward. And we sat around with each other. We had a mini conference where we presented our abstracts and each person around the table commented on our abstracts. I personally found it enormously stimulating, and it was a very warm, very supportive, very lively session. Then we decided, well, we're all working forward on this. Why don't we actually write proper papers? And so we then committed to each other that we would write a 5,000 or an 8,000 word paper. And we had a conference, a one-day conference, where we presented papers to each other and other people then discussed. And then we had a subsequent conference where we invited theologians to come and react to what we'd said and to give us advice. And now we're moving towards a publication in a journal. And the topics were absolutely wonderful that my various colleagues were working on. Christians in the future of foreign aid, for instance, or another topic was how to protect vulnerable immigrants. Somebody wrote on the impact of belief in Christian responses to humanitarian emergencies. Somebody else wrote on political violence and armed conflict, and another person on repentance and forgiveness in post-colonial settler societies. So each of us were already working on some of these topics, but because we worked together in a scholarly circle, we widened and deepened our conversation in order to much improve our work as scholars, let alone our understanding as Christians. Another approach, which I won't go into today, is something that was tried very effectively at the University of Chicago called Truth and Text Lunchtime Discussions, where John Mulholland, who is active with IFES, invited Christian professors just to come and have lunch with a group of students, 50 minutes, where the faculty member would talk informally about what they were doing, give some Christian reflections, and then move from there to a more general discussion with the students. Again, wonderful topics: human rights, faith in the arts, biblical interpretation, really fascinating topics. Now let's turn to the university community as a whole and informal, wider discussions. These are opportunities to get together with people in the university who may not necessarily share our faith, but they're our friends. They may be people that we know to be open to general discussion. And here we can enter into a conversation with them to discover what they're interested in. If they're people who are thoughtful about ethics or they're from another religion, then we can ask them what their ethical or religious views are about what they're working on. And that then might open up a conversation with me and with my views. I can ask their advice as to ways they think that I, as a Christian, should think about something. or I could even suggest how I as a Christian think about something. And so then ask them if my way of thinking makes sense to them. One of the ways in which I try to be a little bit deliberate about this is to invite other faculty members or new doctoral students or new postdocs out to lunch. And so I want to know what it is that they're working on, so in a collegial kind of a way. But in the course of the conversation, I also try and ask about these same issues. What are their ethical, or do they have religious views? And then I try and provide a kind of a perspective on what it is that I'm doing and how I think about it. Let me conclude by talking a little bit. Let me conclude by talking just a little about challenges and opportunities. Obviously, everything that we've talked about here needs to be adapted to the context and the situation and the culture of every university. Every university is different. Things that are possible in one university are simply not possible in another university. Universities have very different kinds of atmospheres, and so we have to be sensitive to what works in our situation and what will not. We should acknowledge that almost all of us, I would say probably all of us, have fears about some of the kinds of visions that we are opening up and discussing here, because we're being asked to lead with a weak hand. We're being asked to talk to other people about topics on which we know very little. We may also feel ourselves to be theologically inadequate. We don't really know ourselves how to think very well theologically about our work, and we may not know how to think very well theologically about other people's work. And thus we are called upon to find ways to overcome. We can do that by beginning with very small, simple steps with people that are close to us and people that we trust. We can begin informally, and so move step by step. Then, of course, the big question will be what we will discuss in our fourth session, and that is, how can we think theologically about some of these topics? Now, the answer to that question and much more information on each of the other topics on which we have been discussing today and in previous sessions can be found at this website, Resources for Engaging the University. There you'll find many detailed notes under the tab of presentations, and you'll also find detailed descriptions of some of the programs on several continents that have been used, like Passion Talks or Discovering a Christian Mind, or the Superb Summer Institute in New Delhi. So with that, I look forward to our next session. May God enlarge all of our visions for the university as we labor together in this magnificent institution.